The blood on her skirt was the last thing she saw before the world went black. It had dried to the color of rust, a grim map of the child she'd lost somewhere on the unforgiving Kansas prairie. 3 days of walking had turned her feet into a mess of blisters and her soul into a hollow, aching void. Then she heard it, the distant whistle of a locomotive, a sound that promised escape, or at least an end to the endless walking. Sarah Holloway stumbled toward the sound, toward the tiny wooden depot of a town called Whispering Creek, praying her legs would hold. They didn't. The few travelers on the platform barely gave her a second glance. A woman in a dirty, torn calico dress, gaunt and pale as a ghost, stumbling up the steps. She reached for the depot wall to steady herself, but her fingers found only empty air. The wooden planks rushed up to meet her, and she collapsed in a heap of broken dreams. She could hear murmurs, people shuffling away, but no one offered a hand. Until a deep voice cut through the fog. "Stand back, folks. Give the lady some air." A pair of worn leather boots appeared in her vision. A man knelt beside her, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. Sarah flinched when he reached for her, a lifetime of caution screaming in her head. "Don't be afraid, madam," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You're safe now." He lifted her to a sitting position, his arm strong around her back. When he took off his hat, she found herself looking into the kindest eyes she'd ever seen, blue as a summer sky. "Name's Clayton Reed," he said softly, offering a canteen. "And from the looks of it, you've been through hell to get here." Sarah's lips could barely form words. "I have nothing," she whispered, her empty hands trembling in her lap. It was the truest thing she could say. She had nothing. No husband, no child, no home. Nothing. Clayton's gaze was steady. He covered her trembling hands with one of his own, large, warm, calloused from work. "Mine are full enough to share," he said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to offer a piece of his life to a complete stranger. And just like that, the tears she'd been too dehydrated to shed finally came, spilling down her dirt-streaked cheeks. She didn't resist when this cowboy, this stranger, lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. He carried her away from the prying eyes of the crowd, his stride long and sure. "Doc Miller's place isn't far," he explained, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "He's a good man. Won't ask for payment up front." Sarah rested her head against his shoulder, the steady beat of his heart an unexpected comfort. "Why?" she whispered, the one question her weary mind could form. Clayton adjusted his hold, his expression softening in a way that made her ache. "Madam, I've seen enough suffering to last 10 lifetimes. Some folks look away. I can't." He carried her down the single dusty street of Whispering Creek, past the saloon and the general store, a parade of one for the curious townsfolk. At the doctor's small office, an older man with spectacles on his nose appeared in the doorway. "Clayton Reed," he said, a friendly grumble in his voice. "What trouble have you brought me now?" "Not trouble, Doc," Clayton answered, carrying Sarah inside and laying her gently on an examination table. "Just someone who needs help." Doc Miller was kind but professional, his hands gentle as he examined her. He didn't have to ask about the baby. He could tell just by looking, by the sad, hollow space in her abdomen. "You've recently lost a child," he stated quietly. Sarah could only nod, fresh tears welling up. "On the prairie," she choked out. 3 days ago." The doctor's eyes filled with a deep, weary compassion. "I'm very sorry, Miss Holloway. There's some infection setting in. You'll need rest, medicine, and proper food." He paused. "You have any family here?" "No one anywhere," she whispered. The stark truth of it hung in the air. While the doctor worked, Clayton stood just outside the door, a silent guardian. When Sarah finally drifted into an exhausted sleep, she heard their hushed voices. "Needs care." Nowhere to go. Infection. It was the last thing she remembered before the darkness took her. When she woke, the world had changed. She was clean, wearing a simple cotton nightgown and lying in a proper bed. Clayton was sitting in a chair nearby, his hat in his hands, just watching her. "You're still here," she said, her voice a little stronger. He offered a small, tired smile. "Promised I would be." He explained that he'd taken care of the doctor's bill, that she could stay as long as she needed to recover. Sarah studied him, suspicion a hard-learned instinct. Men in her experience always wanted something. Kindness was just a currency they used to buy what they were really after. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked, her voice flat. "A stranger?" Clayton looked her straight in the eye, and there wasn't a trace of deception in his gaze. 5 years ago, I was the one collapsed in the dirt, beaten half to death after rustlers took my herd. Someone helped me when I had nothing. Seems only right to pass that kindness along. It was so simple, so direct that it disarmed her. There was no slick story, no hidden angle. Just a man with honest eyes and a debt he felt he owed to the world. But Sarah knew better. She knew that nothing was ever that simple. And she had a feeling that whatever debt Clayton Reed was paying, it was far bigger than the one he'd just described. Over the next few days, Sarah's strength slowly returned. Doc Miller's treatments worked, and the regular meals Clayton delivered brought a touch of color back to her cheeks. He never stayed long, always polite, always keeping a respectful distance. His brief visits became the one thing she looked forward to. On the 4th morning, she found a parcel at the foot of her bed. Inside was a simple, clean dress, undergarments, and a pair of sturdy boots. "Clayton brought these by at dawn," the doctor explained. "Said a lady ought to have her dignity when she's on the mend." The gesture was so thoughtful it made her ache. Her late husband, Thomas, had been full of sweet words during their courtship, but that sweetness had curdled into bitterness and blame the moment they were married. Kindness had become a foreign language to her. Later that day, dressed in the new clothes, Sarah was sitting by the window when Clayton arrived. He stopped in the doorway, momentarily taken aback. "Miss Holloway," he said with a nod. "It's good to see you up." "Thanks to you," she said, gesturing to the dress. "This was very kind. I don't know how I'll repay you." He shook his head. "No repayment necessary." He shifted his weight, looking almost nervous. "I've come with a proposition, though, if you're willing to hear it." Sarah tensed immediately. Here it was, the price, the other shoe dropping. Noticing her reaction, Clayton added quickly, "It's just a job offer, madam. Nothing improper." "A job?" She relaxed, but only slightly. "I own a small ranch a few miles from town," he explained, rushing the words. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Byron, is getting on in years. She could use help with the cooking and cleaning. It would be a respectable position. Your own room, meals, fair wages. Mrs. Byron lives in the house, too. You'd never be alone with me. Your reputation would be safe." The offer was a lifeline, but it was also a chain, tying her to him, to this town, to a debt she could never truly repay. "You barely know me, Mr. Reed," she said, testing him. "I know enough," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "You're down on your luck, but you're not broken by it. That says something about a person's character." Her options were non-existent. No money, no family, nowhere to go. "Would I be able to leave?" she asked, the question tasting of a freedom she wasn't sure she'd ever have again. "Any time," he answered without hesitation. "And I'd pay your stage fare wherever you wanted to go." It was the perfect answer. Too perfect. A way out, handed to her on a silver platter by a man who seemed to have no flaws. And in Sarah's experience, the more perfect a thing seemed, the more terrible the secret it was hiding. She looked at this kind, handsome rancher, this savior who had appeared out of nowhere, and a cold dread washed over her. She was walking into a trap. She just didn't know what kind yet. A week later, Sarah found herself in a wagon beside Clayton, heading toward his ranch. The prairie shimmered under the late August sun, a vast, beautiful, and lonely expanse. "It's not much," Clayton said as they crested a rise, revealing a modest ranch house nestled in a grove of cottonwoods. "But it's mine, free and clear." There was a quiet pride in his voice, the pride of a man who had built something from nothing. As they drew closer, an older woman with iron-gray hair and shrewd, assessing eyes emerged from the house. This was Mrs. Bayern, or Agnes, as she insisted on being called. "So you're the girl Clayton's been fussing over," she said, her tone all business. "Good. We need another pair of hands. These cowboys can eat more than a plague of locusts." Her directness was a relief. There were no hidden meanings in Agnes's words. She led Sarah into a surprisingly comfortable home, clean and well kept. "Clayton built most of this himself," Agnes explained. "Started with just a one-room cabin. Sarah's room was small but private, with a window overlooking a creek. It was more than she'd had in a very long time. Clayton said you've had a rough go of it," Agnes said, her sharp eyes softening just a little. "Well, you won't find any prying questions from me. Everyone deserves a fresh start." That night at supper, she met the two ranch hands, Pete and Jonah. They were polite but shy, clearly unused to having another woman at the table. Clayton was quiet, but Sarah felt his eyes on her throughout the meal. It wasn't a predatory gaze, not like the ones she was used to. It was something else, something she couldn't quite name. Later, as she lay in her new bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch, she thought about him, his quiet strength, his unwavering kindness. It all seemed too good to be true. Thomas had taught her that when something seemed that way, it always was. She was waiting for the other shoe to drop. She just hoped that when it did, it wouldn't crush what little hope she had left. The days settled into a comfortable rhythm. Sarah's strength returned, and she fell into the work of the household, finding a simple satisfaction in the daily chores. Agnes was a demanding but fair teacher, and a bond of mutual respect grew between the two women. Clayton, however, kept his distance. He was always gone before dawn and often returned late, eating his supper alone after she and Agnes had cleared the table. "That man is riding extra fence lines just to give you breathing room," Agnes commented one afternoon as they kneaded dough. "Never seen him stay away from his own table so much." "I don't want to disrupt his home," Sarah said, focusing on the dough. Agnes fixed her with a knowing look. "It's not disruption he's avoiding, girl. It's his own interest in you." The old woman's words were blunt, but they rang with truth. "He's kind to every stray in the territory," Agnes continued, "but he doesn't look at them the way he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching." The observation made Sarah deeply uneasy. She'd seen that look. It was a look of profound loneliness, a hunger that had nothing to do with food. It was the look of a man who was missing something vital, and for some reason he seemed to think she was the one who could provide it. Her past had taught her to be terrified of that kind of need in a man. It was a void that could swallow a woman whole. That evening, Clayton came home early. Sarah watched him across the supper table, comparing him to Thomas. Where her husband had been quick to anger, Clayton was measured and calm. Where Thomas had been all sharp edges and explosive temper, Clayton was solid, steady. But was that calm a mask? Was there a rage simmering beneath that quiet exterior, waiting for the right moment to boil over? After supper, when Agnes and the hands had retired, he found her on the porch. "Evening's pleasant," he said, taking a seat a respectful distance away. They sat in silence for a while, watching the first stars prick the darkening sky. "I grew up in Ohio," he said suddenly. "Never saw stars like this. Too many trees." "Missouri," she offered in return. Near Springfield. Long way from home, he observed. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself. This is home now. There's nothing left for me back there. He didn't press for details, just nodded. I understand that feeling. He told her about leaving his family's farm after the war, drifting west, saving every penny until he found this piece of land. When I saw this land, he said, his voice low and earnest, something just fit. Sometimes you just know where you belong. His words touched a raw nerve. She'd never known that feeling. She'd always been a guest in someone else's life, a supporting player in another person's story. Never the hero of her own. I've never known that feeling, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Clayton's expression softened. Maybe you will someday. He was so good, so decent. It had to be a lie. It had to be an act. No man was this patient. No man was this understanding. He was playing a long game, lulling her into a false sense of security. But why? What did he want from her? What was the terrible secret he was hiding behind those kind blue eyes? She looked out at the vast, dark prairie, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid of the wilderness. She was afraid of the man sitting right next to her. October brought the cattle roundup, and the ranch buzzed with activity. Sarah and Agnes worked from dawn till dusk, cooking for a dozen hungry men. "You're a godsend," Agnes declared one night over a mountain of dishes. "Even Clayton's noticed. Said yesterday this place is finally starting to feel like a real home." The words warmed Sarah more than she wanted to admit. She was becoming more and more aware of Clayton, the way he handled a spooked horse with a gentle hand, the way his men respected him without fearing him. But every time he looked at her with that quiet intensity, the old fear would whisper in her ear. It's a trap. On the final night of the roundup, there was a big celebration. Neighbors came from miles around. There was music, dancing, and more food than Sarah had ever seen in one place. "Miss Sarah, these are the finest apple pies this side of the Mississippi," one old rancher declared. "Clayton's a lucky man to have found you." "I'm just the housekeeper," she mumbled, her cheeks flushing. The old man's eyes twinkled. For now, maybe. Later, she slipped away from the noise and into the quiet of the kitchen. The door opened behind her. It was Clayton. "Hiding out?" he asked. "Just catching my breath," she said. He stepped inside, his presence filling the small room. "You've worked harder than anyone this week," he said. "The men can't stop talking about your cooking." "It's nothing special." "It is to them," he said, his voice dropping. "To me." He moved closer, the careful distance he always kept between them vanishing. "You've brought something to this place, Sarah. Something it was missing." The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "A kind of gentleness," he said softly. "That makes a house more than just a place to sleep." His sincerity was a physical force, pressing in on her. "I should be thanking you," she managed. "You gave me a chance when I had nothing." He shook his head. "You had plenty, courage, resilience, the strength to keep going when most would have given up." His hand moved, as if to touch her face. Then he seemed to think better of it and let it drop. "I admire that more than I can say." The air between them crackled with unspoken words. For a dizzying moment, Sarah wanted to close the distance between them, to feel his arms around her, to believe that this man was exactly who he seemed to be. But the ghost of Thomas stood between them, a cold reminder of how charming a monster could be before he showed his teeth. A burst of loud laughter from outside shattered the moment. Clayton stepped back, his expression shuddering again into one of careful neutrality. "I should get back to my guests." After he left, Sarah pressed her cool hands to her flushed cheeks. The feelings he stirred in her were terrifying. They felt too much like the feelings she'd had for Thomas at the very beginning. It was a path she'd walked before, and she knew the terrible place it led. She couldn't shake the feeling that Clayton's kindness was just a different kind of cage, one with softer bars, but a cage nonetheless. And the bait was the one thing she craved most, a place to belong. The first significant snowfall came in early December, blanketing the ranch in a pristine, silent white. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching the world transform. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Clayton's voice came from just behind her, so close she could feel the warmth of his body. First snow always feels like the world's being made new. "It covers everything that's broken," she said, not turning around. "Makes it look whole again, at least for a little while." He moved to stand beside her. "Some things that seem broken can be mended for good, Sarah, not just covered up." He wasn't looking at the snow. He was looking at her. And in his eyes, she saw an unwavering belief that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. "I'm not sure I believe that," she whispered. "I do," he said. He reached for her hand, his movements slow, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. He unfolded her small hand in his large, warm one, and his thumb gently stroked her palm. The simple touch sent a jolt through her entire body. It was a touch that promised not to take, but to give. A touch that promised safety. It had to be a lie. "Clayton! Sarah!" Agnes's voice, sharp with urgency, shattered the moment. "Come quick! There's a rider coming in, looks half frozen." They rushed to the front of the house. Through the swirling snow, a lone figure slumped on a horse, barely holding on. Clayton didn't hesitate. He pulled on his coat and plunged into the snowdrift, reaching the horse just as the rider was about to fall. He helped the person down, half carrying them toward the house. As they drew closer, Sarah saw with a start that it wasn't a man. It was a woman. Young, maybe in her early 20s, her face blue with cold. Her clothes were thin, completely inadequate for the blizzard. They brought her inside, settling her in a chair by the fire. As Agnes and Sarah worked to warm her, Clayton knelt beside her. "Can you tell us your name, miss?" he asked gently. Her eyes fluttered open. Fear. Sarah recognized that look. It was the same fear she saw in her own reflection every morning. "Charlotte," the woman whispered through chattering teeth. "Charlotte Wilson." "What brings you out in a storm like this, Charlotte?" Clayton asked. Her answer was a single choked word: running. She took a ragged breath, her eyes darting toward the door as if she expected a monster to burst through it. "My husband," she gasped, tears freezing on her cheeks. "He'll kill me if he finds me." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. It was her own story, her own terror, playing out right in front of her. Clayton's expression hardened into something she'd never seen before, a cold, dangerous anger. "No one will harm you here," he said, his voice low and absolute. "You have my word." Charlotte just shook her head, sobbing. "He'll come looking. Marcus always finds me." As the warmth from the fire brought some color back to her face, Sarah saw it, a faded purple bruise along her jawline, barely visible. The sight awakened every ghost from her own past. The memory of her own bruises, of Thomas's rage, of the desperate, hopeless feeling of being trapped. This wasn't just a stranger. This was a mirror. And seeing her own past reflected in Charlotte's terrified eyes, Sarah knew one thing with absolute certainty. The arrival of this woman was not a coincidence. The storm that had brought her here was nothing compared to the storm that was about to break over all of their heads. While Charlotte slept, exhausted by the fire, Clayton pulled Sarah out onto the porch. The wind howled, whipping snow around them, but they barely noticed. "This complicates things," he said, his voice grim. "If her husband is as dangerous as she says—" "We can't turn her away," Sarah said, her own voice fierce. It wasn't a question. Clayton's eyes softened. "I wasn't suggesting we should." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration. The sheriff in Whispering Creek isn't worth much. We'll have to handle this ourselves. He looked at her, his gaze searching her face. You think he'll really come here? If he's the kind of man who beats his wife, she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth, his pride will demand it. Men like that consider their wives property. The accuracy of her statement hung between them. I know, she added softly. Understanding dawned in Clayton's eyes. Your husband? He asked, his voice gentle. Sarah couldn't meet his gaze. She just nodded. Thomas wasn't kind. It was the most she could admit, the most she could give voice to. The full truth was a monster she kept locked away. He died of fever last summer, she continued, her voice flat. I thought things would get better. Then I found out I was with child. She had to stop, the memory of that brief, fragile hope too painful to bear. I lost the baby on the road, 3 days before you found me. I had nothing left. Without a word, Clayton pulled her into his arms. She stiffened for a moment. Then, for the first time in years, she let herself lean on someone else. She collapsed against his chest, the solid warmth of him a shield against the howling wind and the ghosts of her past. His embrace was firm, secure, and utterly safe. You have a home now, he murmured into her hair, for as long as you want it. She pulled back just enough to look up at him, the sincerity in his eyes stealing her breath. Why are you so good to me? She whispered. His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. Because from the moment I saw you at that depot, he said, his voice thick with emotion, something in me recognized something in you. Like finding a piece of yourself you didn't know was missing. The simple, profound truth of his words broke through years of cynicism and fear. Just as she was about to answer, to tell him that maybe, just maybe, she was starting to feel the same way, Agnes called from inside. Charlotte was awake and panicking. The moment was shattered. They rushed back in to find the young woman trying to get up. I can't stay here, she cried. I'm putting you all in danger. You don't understand. Marcus has friends, money, influence. So do I, Clayton said, his voice calm and steady as a rock. And more importantly, I have neighbors who will stand with me against any man who mistreats a woman. His quiet confidence seemed to calm Charlotte, and she sank back into the chair. That night, after Charlotte was settled, Sarah found Clayton on the porch again, staring out into the storm. I meant what I said earlier, he said without turning around, about this being your home. She moved to stand beside him. What if I wanted it to be my home forever? He turned then, and the look on his face was one of raw, unguarded hope. Are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying, she said, her heart pounding, that I've come to care for you, Clayton Reed, more than I thought was possible. A slow smile spread across his face, warm as a sunrise. I've been falling in love with you since the day I found you, Sarah Holloway. He took her hands in his. I can't promise life won't be hard, but I can promise you'll never face it alone again. And I promise these hands will never, ever cause you pain. He lifted their joined hands. They're full enough to share whatever comes our way. The echo of his words from that first day broke her heart open. Slowly, giving her every chance to retreat, he lowered his face to hers. Their first kiss was gentle, a question, and she answered by leaning into him, allowing herself, for the first time, to truly believe. I love you, she whispered when they finally parted. The peaceful moment was instantly destroyed by a shout from the barn. Riders coming. At least 3 of them. Clayton straightened, his expression instantly shifting from tender to deadly serious. Get inside, he commanded. Stay with Charlotte. From the window, Sarah watched them approach. 3 mounted men, dark shapes against the swirling snow. The leader was a well-dressed man who carried himself with an air of absolute arrogance. Even from a distance, Sarah felt a chill of recognition. This was the kind of man Thomas had always aspired to be. Powerful, cruel, and certain of his right to own the world. "I've come for my wife," the man's voice boomed, carrying clearly through the night. "Send her out now." "Your wife isn't property to be claimed," Clayton replied, his voice deceptively calm. "She's made her choice to leave you." The man, Marcus Wilson, let out a cold, humorless laugh. "A woman doesn't get to choose. The law's on my side, cowboy." "Maybe in town," Clayton said, "but out here, a man who beats his wife isn't welcome on my land." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Marcus's hand drifted toward his coat. Instantly, Clayton and Jonah raised their rifles. "I wouldn't," Clayton warned, his voice like ice. Marcus slowly withdrew his hand, his face a mask of fury. "This isn't over," he spat. "I'll be back, with the sheriff." "You do that," Clayton said calmly, "and I'll have a witness ready to testify about your wife's condition when she arrived." After they rode off, Clayton came inside, his face grim. "He'll be back," he said, "and he'll have the law with him." They had to get Charlotte away, somewhere Marcus couldn't reach her. The plan was made quickly. Jonah would take her to the train station in the next county. From there, she'd go to Clayton's sister in Colorado. As they prepared, Charlotte looked at Clayton, her eyes full of awe. "You'd do all this for me? A stranger?" Clayton's gaze met Sarah's across the room. "Someone once did the same for me," he said. "It's only right to pass that kindness along." That night, unable to sleep, Sarah found Clayton at the kitchen table. "Earlier tonight," he said, taking her hand, "before all this. I meant every word. I love you, Sarah. I want to build a life with you, not as my housekeeper, as my wife." Tears streamed down her face. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "After knowing what my past holds?" "Your past made you the woman I love," he said firmly. "The strength it took to survive. That's what I admire most." She moved to stand before him. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I'll marry you, Clayton Reed." Joy transformed his face as he stood and gathered her into his arms. Their kiss was no longer a question, but an answer, a promise of a new beginning. But as he held her, a terrible thought crept into Sarah's mind. Clayton had a story about rustlers and being left for dead, a story about a kindness he was repaying. But what if that wasn't the whole story? What if his past was just as dark as hers? What if Marcus Wilson, in his digging, found a secret that could destroy not just Clayton, but this new life they had just promised to build? The safe harbor Clayton had created suddenly felt terrifyingly fragile, like a house built on sand, waiting for the tide to come in. Dawn broke, and with it, a flurry of activity. Jonah had the wagon ready, and Agnes packed enough food for a week. As Charlotte prepared to leave, she embraced Sarah tightly. "I'll never be able to repay you," she whispered. "Live a good life," Sarah told her. "That's repayment enough." They watched the wagon disappear into the snowy landscape. When they turned back to the house, Agnes was waiting on the porch with a knowing look. "So," she said, "when's the wedding?" Clayton laughed, putting his arm around Sarah. "Is spring too long to wait?" he asked. "Spring sounds perfect," Sarah said, leaning against him. "A new beginning in a season of new beginnings." It felt right. But the peace didn't last. 3 days later, just as Clayton had predicted, Marcus Wilson returned, and this time he had the portly, sweating sheriff of Whispering Creek with him. "Your wife isn't here, Wilson," Clayton stated calmly from the porch. "A husband has a right to his wife's whereabouts, Reed," the sheriff blustered. "Not when he abuses those rights," Sarah spoke up, stepping forward. "Charlotte arrived here with bruises on her face and terror in her eyes." Wilson's face contorted with rage. "You have no proof. This is kidnapping." "Actually," Agnes interjected, producing a folded piece of paper. "We have Charlotte's sworn statement witnessed by myself and Sarah detailing the abuse she suffered at your hands." The sheriff's face fell. He was a man who followed the path of least resistance, and a written statement was a boulder in that path. Wilson, seeing he'd lost, wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over, Reed," he yelled. "No one crosses Marcus Wilson without consequences." He galloped off, leaving the sheriff to make an awkward retreat. The weeks that followed were quiet. A letter arrived from Colorado confirming Charlotte had arrived safely. With that worry gone, Sarah and Clayton began to plan their wedding. Word spread, and the community embraced her in a way she'd never experienced. She wasn't an outsider anymore. She was Clayton Reed's intended, and that meant she belonged. But the threat of Marcus Wilson lingered in the back of her mind like a dark cloud. A man with that much pride and that much venom doesn't just give up. He waits, he watches, and he looks for a weakness. A week before the wedding, they rode into town for supplies. Whispering Creek was bustling, and everywhere they went, people called out congratulations. It was almost enough to make Sarah forget her fears. They were in the general store when the bell over the door jingled. Sarah glanced up, and her blood ran cold. Marcus Wilson stood in the doorway, a cruel smirk on his face. "Wilson," Clayton said, his voice flat and hard as he moved to stand between them. "My business in this territory isn't quite finished, Reed," Wilson said, his eyes fixed on Sarah. "I see congratulations are in order. Planning to rescue this one, too." He took a step closer. "I wonder if your fiancé knows everything about you, Mrs. Holloway. Or should I say, Miss Connors?" The name, her maiden name, hit her like a punch to the gut. No one here knew it. "I made some inquiries about the woman who helped steal my wife," Wilson continued, savoring the moment. "Imagine my surprise when I discovered Sarah Holloway's interesting history. Tell me, Reed, does she ever talk about her first fiancé? The one she jilted at the altar?" It was a twisted version of the truth, but there was enough of it to be a weapon. She had been engaged before Thomas. She had run. But not because she was fickle. She'd run because she discovered her fiancé, James Porter, was a counterfeiter, a criminal who had threatened her into silence. Thomas Holloway had seemed like a refuge, a way out. She hadn't realized she was just trading one prison for another. "My past is none of your concern," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Perhaps not," Wilson said with a mock bow. "But secrets have a way of poisoning things, especially secrets about why a woman runs from the altar." He turned his venomous gaze back to Clayton. "But then, you know all about secrets, don't you, Reed? You two are a perfect match. A runaway bride, and a man with blood on his hands." Sarah stared at him, confused. What was he talking about? Wilson smiled, a real triumphant smile this time. "You tell a good story, Reed, about rustlers leaving you for dead. A real sob story. But you always leave out the best part." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that everyone in the silent store could hear. "You leave out the part about your partner, the man you killed in that fight, the man whose share of the money you took before you reinvented yourself as a saint here in Whispering Creek." The world tilted on its axis. Sarah looked at Clayton. His face was pale, his jaw tight as stone. He didn't deny it. The silence was a confession. The kindness, the generosity, the story about repaying a debt. It was all a lie. A cover for a secret far darker than her own. The man who had saved her, the man she was going to marry, was a killer and a thief. The foundation of her new life, the very ground beneath her feet, had just crumbled into dust. The ride back to the ranch was silent and suffocating. Every kind word Clayton had ever spoken now seemed like a calculated lie. Every gentle touch felt like a deception. He had built his entire life, this reputation as a good and honest man, on a bedrock of violence and theft. He was no different from Thomas or James Porter. He was just better at hiding it. When they reached the ranch, Sarah slid off her horse and faced him, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Is it true? Clayton wouldn't meet her eyes. He stared at the ground, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Yes, he said, the word barely audible, but it's not the way Wilson made it sound. Isn't it? She shot back, her voice dripping with a bitterness she hadn't felt since Thomas died. Is there a version of the story where you didn't kill a man and take his money? He finally looked at her, and the anguish in his eyes was so profound, it almost broke through her anger. His name was Ben. We were partners. We'd saved up for years to buy this land. But he got greedy. He made a deal with the rustlers to sell out our own herd, to fake the attack and split the money. I found out. I confronted him. His voice broke. We fought. It was a terrible accident, Sarah. He pulled a knife. I was just trying to defend myself. He fell. And the money? She asked, her voice like ice. It was my money, too. Half of it was mine, earned with my own sweat. I took my half and I left. I came here to start over, to try and be the man I should have been. Every good thing I've done since that day has been an attempt to balance the scales, to pay for what I did. He took a step toward her, his hands outstretched. When I found you at that depot, so broken, I saw a chance to save someone because I couldn't save Ben. I couldn't save myself. His confession was a torrent of pain and regret, but all Sarah could hear was the echo of other men's excuses. Thomas was always sorry after he hit her. James was always sorry he'd gotten caught. They were all sorry when it was too late. So I was just a project for you, she said, the words twisting like a knife in her own gut. A way for you to feel better about yourself? Your charity case? No, he cried, his voice raw. Never. I fell in love with you, Sarah. None of that was a lie. But she couldn't believe him. Not anymore. The trust she had so tentatively placed in him was shattered. I need to think, she said, turning and walking toward the house, each step feeling like she was wading through mud. She walked past Agnes, who stood on the porch with a worried expression, and went straight to her room, closing the door behind her. She had run from James. She had run from Thomas. And now it seemed she had to run from Clayton. It was the only thing she knew how to do. The pattern of her life was inescapable. Every time she thought she'd found a safe harbor, it turned out to be just another storm. She sat on her bed. The wedding dress Agnes had so carefully laid out, seeming to mock her from the corner of the room. There would be no wedding. There would be no happy ending. There was only the prairie and the long, lonely road. But as she sat there, a different thought began to form. A cold, hard kernel of anger. Marcus Wilson had done this. He had come to their home, threatened them, and when that didn't work, he had sought out the one weapon that could tear them apart. He hadn't just exposed Clayton's past, he had stolen her future. And for the first time in her life, Sarah Holloway didn't feel like running. She felt like fighting back. The door creaked open. It was Agnes holding a cup of tea. She said nothing, just set it down and sat on the edge of the bed. Men are fools, she said finally, her voice rough but kind. They carry their pasts around like a sack of rocks, thinking if they just walk far enough they can leave it behind. But it doesn't work that way. She looked at Sarah, her shrewd eyes seeing everything. That man out there loves you more than he loves his own life. I've known him for 6 years. I know the man he is, not the boy he was. He killed someone, Agnes, Sarah whispered. And it has haunted him every single day since, Agnes replied. The question isn't what he did back then. The question is what you're going to do now. Are you going to let a snake like Marcus Wilson win? Are you going to let him poison the best thing that ever happened to either of you? Agnes's words hit their mark. Sarah thought about Charlotte, now safe and starting a new life because Clayton had refused to back down. She thought about the respect his neighbors had for him, the loyalty of his men. She thought about the gentle way he held her, the unwavering belief he had in her own strength. Was all of that a lie? Or was it the truest thing in the world? She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the ranch Clayton had built from nothing but his own 2 hands and a guilty conscience. He had built a life here, a good life, and Marcus Wilson was not going to take it from them. She found Clayton in the barn, staring blindly at the wall, the picture of despair. "Wilson is going to go to the sheriff," she said, her voice steady. "He's going to tell him everything." Clayton didn't even turn around. "I know. He's expecting us to run, or to fall apart." She walked over and stood beside him. "We're not going to do either." He looked at her then, his eyes wide with surprise. "Sarah? You made a mistake a long time ago," she said. "You've spent every day since trying to atone for it. That doesn't make you a monster. It makes you a man." She took his hand, her grip firm. "My husband Thomas was cruel for the sake of being cruel. Marcus Wilson is the same. You are not like them. I was a fool to ever think you were." Relief so profound it was almost painful washed over his face. "But what do we do? When the sheriff comes—" "You're going to tell him the truth," she said. "The whole truth, before Wilson gets the chance to twist it into a lie." It was a terrifying gamble. They rode into Whispering Creek together, side by side, and walked straight into the sheriff's office. The lawman looked stunned as Clayton, his voice low and steady, confessed everything about his past. He told him about Ben, about the fight, about the money. He laid his entire life bare on the sheriff's dusty desk. When he was finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Just then, the door burst open and Marcus Wilson strode in, a triumphant sneer on his face. "Sheriff, I'm here to report a crime. This man," he said, pointing a dramatic finger at Clayton, "is a murderer and a thief." The sheriff leaned back in his chair, looking from Wilson to Clayton. "He already told me, Wilson." Wilson's jaw dropped. "What?" "The whole story," the sheriff said. "Seems to me like a case of self-defense from a long time ago in a different territory. Not really my jurisdiction." He paused, then looked at Wilson with open dislike. "But what is my jurisdiction is a man coming into my town and making threats. I've had a few complaints about you since you've been around, Mr. Wilson. From some very influential ranchers who happen to be good friends of Mr. Reed's. They don't take kindly to bullies." The sneer vanished from Wilson's face, replaced by disbelief, then rage. He had played his trump card, and it had failed. He had lost. Without another word, he turned and stormed out of the office. They watched him ride out of town, a man defeated not by a gun, but by the truth, and by the quiet strength of a community that knew the measure of a man's character. The wedding day dawned clear and bright. The entire community was there, a testament to the life Clayton had built. As Sarah walked toward him, she wasn't walking toward a perfect man or a flawless savior. She was walking toward a man who was scarred and imperfect, just like her. A man who knew the weight of his past, but wasn't broken by it. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Clayton's kiss was a promise. Not of a life without hardship, but of a life where they would face every hardship together. 5 years later, Sarah stood on the porch of their expanded ranch house, a hand resting on the swell of her second child. In the yard, Clayton was leading their 3-year-old daughter Emma on her first pony. The ranch had prospered, their family had grown. Letters from Charlotte told of her own happiness, married to a kind rancher in Colorado. The shadows of the past had finally, truly faded, replaced by the bright, warm sunlight of the present. That night, as she tucked Emma into bed, the little girl made her usual request. "Tell the story, Mama, about you and Papa." Sarah smiled, stroking her daughter's hair. "Once upon a time," she began, "a very tired lady arrived in a small town with empty hands and a broken heart. But a kind cowboy saw her and said, "My hands are full enough to share." He wasn't a perfect man, and he had his own ghosts. But he shared his strength, and she shared her courage, and together they built a life filled with more love than either of them had ever thought possible. "And they lived happily ever after," Emma murmured sleepily. "Yes, my darling," Sarah whispered, looking up to see Clayton standing in the doorway, his eyes full of love. "They most certainly did." If you enjoyed this story of how two broken people found a way to mend each other, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button. You never know what secrets the next story will uncover.